The rain that changed everything, the rain came softly that evening. Fine silver mist that blurred the lights of the city into watercolor streaks. Inside a small corner cafe, Amelia Rivers sat by the window, her hands wrapped around a cup of chamomile tea that had long gone cold. She watched people hurry past with umbrellas, their lives moving forward while hers seemed to stand still. For years, Amelia had lived quietly working at a local library, caring for her sick mother and reading novels that reminded her there was still beauty in the world, even when life felt like a constant storm. Her friends often said she was too gentle for her own good, a phrase that used to make her smile until it began to sound like a curse. She wasn't weak, just careful. She'd seen too many people mistake kindness for permission to hurt. That night, as thunder rolled across the skyline, she almost didn't notice the tall man who entered the cafe, shaking rain from his dark coat. His presence shifted the room's air. He moved with a kind of quiet authority that made people look twice without knowing why. Ethan Ward, billionaire investor and hotel magnate, wasn't supposed to be here. He belonged to glass towers and boardrooms, not a sleepy cafe tucked between an antique shop and a florist. Yet here he was, standing only a few steps from Amelia's table, his gaze scanning the room like he was searching for an anchor in a storm. Their eyes met by accident. For a second, Amelia felt something she couldn't name, a flicker of recognition, as though she'd seen him somewhere in a dream. Ethan's eyes were deep hazel, shadowed and tired, but when he spoke to the barista, his tone was gentle. "Just black coffee, please." His voice was smooth, with a roughness that hinted at sleepless nights. When he turned to find a seat, the cafe was full except for the chair across from Amelia. He hesitated, then nodded toward it. "May I?" Amelia blinked, startled. "Oh, of course." He sat down, his movements precise, as though he was used to controlling everything, even the way he breathed. For a while, neither spoke. Outside, the rain softened, tapping rhythmically against the window pane. Then Ethan noticed the open book beside her cup. "Jane Eyre," he said quietly. "A woman who loved without expecting anything in return." Amelia looked up, surprised that he recognized it. "You've read it?" "Twice," he said, a faint smile tugging at his lips. "Once when I was young and foolish, and again when I was older and a different kind of foolish." That made her laugh softly. It was a sound Ethan hadn't realized he needed until that moment. For the next half hour, their conversation flowed effortlessly from literature to the weather to how the city always looked lonelier in the rain. Ethan didn't talk about himself much. Amelia noticed the way he chose his words carefully, as if everything he said carried weight. She sensed pain behind his composure, like a glass window hiding a storm. When he asked about her, she spoke modestly about her love for books, her mother's illness, and her quiet dream of opening a children's reading center someday, when the cafe announced closing time. Ethan glanced at his untouched coffee and said, "I don't usually do this, but may I walk you home?" Amelia hesitated. Something in his eyes, a blend of sincerity and loneliness, made her nod. "All right." They walked in silence, the world wrapped in soft rain and city light. When they reached her building, Ethan paused at the gate. "Thank you for the company, Miss Rivers. You've made a long day feel human again. Good night, Mr. Ward." He smiled faintly. "Ethan," he corrected. She smiled back. "Good night, Ethan," as he turned to leave. Amelia didn't know that this brief encounter would alter the course of both their lives. The next morning, Ethan found himself standing at his office window, staring at the rain that hadn't yet stopped. He had a meeting in an hour, a presentation worth millions. But all he could think about was the woman from the cafe, the quiet one who didn't look at him with admiration or fear, but with warmth. It had been years since anyone had spoken to him without an agenda. His world was full of people who wanted something: contracts, opportunities, power, but Amelia hadn't wanted anything. She had simply listened. That was new to him. That was dangerous. He picked up the file on his desk. Rivers Book Center. His assistant had left it there with a note. Small library facing foreclosure. Could be an acquisition opportunity. Ethan's chest tightened. Rivers, Amelia's last name. Coincidence? He opened the file. It was indeed the same place she worked. Debt. Failing rent. Final notice. For reasons he couldn't explain, he closed the file and set it aside. He would handle it quietly. That afternoon, Amelia received a call from her landlord, Miss Rivers. "I've just been informed that your building's rent has been paid in full for the next 2 years. Anonymous donor," her breath caught. "What? That can't be right. It's already processed." "You're good, dear." When she hung up, she stood frozen, her heart pounding. She thought of Ethan but dismissed the idea. Billionaires didn't pay the debts of strangers they met once. And yet, when she opened the door of the library the next morning, a bouquet of white lilies sat on the counter with a card that simply said, "Keep the stories alive," no signature. Just a subtle handwriting that looked faintly architectural. Ethan didn't expect to see her again. If it or perhaps something kinder had other plans. 2 weeks later, he returned to the cafe. She was there again, sitting by the same window, reading under the same rain. "Seems like you have a favorite seat," he said as he approached. She looked up, startled, and then smiled. "And you have a habit of appearing when it rains." He took that as permission to sit down. "Maybe that's when I think best," he said. When the world slows down, they talked again, this time about small things that somehow mattered. Favorite childhood memories, places they wanted to visit, people they missed. Amelia found herself opening up more than she ever had to anyone. Ethan listened with quiet intensity, as though her words had value. He didn't interrupt, didn't pretend to fix things, just listened. When she asked about his life, he was vague. "I've built too much and lost too much," he said simply. "Sometimes I wonder if success is just another form of loneliness." Amelia's eyes softened. "Then maybe you just need someone who reminds you of the simple things books. T. Rain," he smiled. "Maybe I already found her." Her cheeks warmed, and she looked down at her book, tending not to notice the weight of his gaze. Over the next few weeks, their paths intertwined naturally. He'd visit the library under the pretense of buying books for his niece, though he had none. He helped her repair a broken shelf, brought coffee on mornings when she was too busy to eat. And once, when her mother's condition worsened, he quietly arranged for the best private doctor to visit. Amelia protested. "Of course. You can't keep doing things like this for me," she said one evening. Standing in the library's quiet aisles, Ethan's expression softened. "Why not? You've given me something I didn't know I needed." "What's that?" "Peace." For a long moment, neither spoke. Then she said softly, "You can't buy peace, Ethan, you can only share it." He nodded slowly, as though her words were the first truth he'd heard in years. That night, Ethan stood in his penthouse overlooking the city, rain blurring the skyline again. He thought of Amelia's laugh, her quiet strength, the way she looked at life as though it was still worth believing in. He had met hundreds of people, powerful, brilliant, ruthless, but none who made him feel human. He didn't know it yet, but for the first time in his life, he wanted to be gentle. Not because he had to, but because she deserved nothing less. And somewhere, across town, Amelia stared at the same rain from her window, her heart whispering a question she wasn't ready to answer. Asterisk walls of glass. Hearts of Clatha rain had stopped 2 days ago. Yet the smell of damp stone and jasmine still hung in the air. Drifting through the open window of Amelia's little apartment, she was shelving new donations for the children's section when the soft chime above the door rang. Her heart gave a small leap before she even turned. Something in her soul already knew who it was. Ethan stood there in a charcoal coat, tall and impossibly composed. But there was warmth in his eyes that hadn't been there before. He carried no entourage, no polished armor of business, only a small paper bag that he set carefully on the counter. "I didn't know what you liked," he said, his voice quieter than usual. "So I brought one of everything from the bakery down the street." Amelia laughed, the sound like sunlight after a storm. "That's a dangerous way to start a friendship." "Friendship," he repeated, as though tasting the word. "I'd like that." "If you'll allow it," she nodded, and something fragile yet alive stirred between them. They ate pastries among stacks of books, the scent of cinnamon mixing with old paper. For the first time in years, Ethan wasn't thinking of quarterly losses or acquisitions. He was thinking of the way Amelia listened with her whole heart, how she smiled at small joys, how she made quiet feel safe. Later, when he offered to drive her home, she hesitated only a moment before agreeing. His car glided through the sleeping city, headlights carving silver paths along wet streets. "You never talk about your family," she said softly, looking out the window. "There isn't much to say," he replied. "My father built an empire out of concrete and glass. My mother filled it with music until she was gone. After that, there was only silence and work to drown it." Amelia turned toward him. "You can build the tallest towers in the world, Ethan, but if no one laughs inside them, they're just empty shells." Her words settled in him like a seed in fertile soil he'd long thought dead. When he dropped her off, he didn't want to leave, yet he simply said, "Good night, Amelia," as though the restraint itself were a form of care. Days folded into weeks. Ethan began visiting the library more often, always under the pretense of donating, always leaving behind something small: rare books, new chairs, fresh paint for the walls. Each gesture was thoughtful, but never invasive. And each time, Amelia's gratitude wasn't in the words she spoke, but in the way her eyes softened when she saw him. One afternoon, as she organized a display, a sleek black sedan stopped outside. A tall man in a tailored suit entered, scanning the modest space with a mixture of confusion and disdain. "Mr. Ward asked me to deliver this," he said briskly, handing her an envelope. "It's a personal invitation." When he left, Amelia opened it with trembling fingers. Inside was a handwritten note. "Saturday evening. The Ward Foundation Gala. I want you there not as a guest, but as the reason I finally believe these events can matter." Her first instinct was to decline. The idea of stepping into Ethan's glittering world terrified her, but when she thought of his quiet sincerity, she couldn't bring herself to say no. Saturday arrived, wrapped in nervous excitement. Amelia wore a simple, pale blue gown borrowed from a friend. Its modest elegance, a stark contrast to the jeweled opulence she found when she stepped into the ballroom. Chandeliers shimmered like captured stars, and music flowed through the air like liquid silver. For a moment, she felt painfully out of place until she saw him. Ethan stood at the far end of the hall, surrounded by executives and dignitaries, yet his gaze found her instantly. The crowd seemed to blur as he walked toward her. "You came," he said, his voice tinged with something that almost sounded like relief. "I did," she replied, trying not to fidget. "Though I'm not sure I belong here." He smiled, the kind that softened his usually sharp features. "Neither do I most nights. But tonight, I finally do." They danced once slowly, cautiously. Around them, people whispered, curious about the mysterious woman who had caught the attention of a man known for being untouchable. Amelia didn't hear them. She only felt the steady rhythm of Ethan's heartbeat under her hand and the strange safety that came with it. When the song ended, he led her to the terrace. The night air was cool, the city sprawling below like a sea of stars. "When I was a boy," he said quietly, "I used to press my face against the glass walls of my father's office and imagine the world outside. I thought if I worked hard enough, I could earn freedom. But the higher I climbed, the thicker the glass became." Amelia looked at him, her eyes gentle. "Maybe freedom isn't about climbing higher. Maybe it's about letting someone in." He met her gaze, and for once didn't look away. "You have a way of breaking walls I didn't know were still standing." She smiled. "Good. Maybe you'll finally see what's outside." Their bond deepened in the days that followed, though neither dared call it love. It was something quieter, like music underwater heard more by the heart than the ear. Ethan began to change in ways his colleagues couldn't understand. He spent less time in boardrooms, more in the library. He started reading again. He even laughed, something that startled his assistant so much she dropped a file. One evening, as the sun dipped behind the skyline, he found Amelia standing on a stool, reaching for the highest shelf. "Careful," he said quickly, stepping forward just as she lost her balance. His hands caught her waist, steadying her against him. For a moment, time stilled, their eyes locked, breath mingling in the space between. Amelia felt her pulse quicken, not from fear, but from something tender and new. Ethan's voice was a whisper. "You make chaos feel calm." She stepped back gently, her cheeks warm. "And you make calm feel complicated." He laughed softly, the sound genuine and unguarded. Fair trade. A week later, Ethan invited her to see one of his hotels under renovation. "It's the first project I've designed myself in years," he said as they walked through unfinished halls lined with scaffolding and the scent of fresh paint. "I want it to feel alive, like a place where people can breathe." Amelia touched the cool marble of the lobby pillars. "It already feels that way," she said. "Because you care." He turned to her, something raw in his eyes. "You make me want to." As they reached the rooftop terrace, a golden sunset poured over the city. Ethan looked out across the skyline. "When this place opens, I'll dedicate it to someone who reminded me that beauty isn't in perfection, it's in gentleness." Amelia's breath caught. "That's the kindest thing anyone's ever said to me. It's only the truth." For a long moment they stood in silence, the wind carrying the scent of rain from far away. The city below glimmered, unaware that in this single quiet moment, two lonely souls had found something neither of them believed they deserved. That night, back in his apartment of glass and silence, Ethan couldn't sleep. The walls felt colder than usual, the emptiness heavier. He poured himself a drink he didn't touch, staring out at the rain beginning once more. For the first time, he realized he didn't want to be alone in his fortress. He wanted laughter in his halls, books on his tables, the warmth of someone who saw the man behind the empire, and in that realization, something in him broke open softly, quietly. Like light finding a crack in stone, he took his phone, hesitated, and typed, "If you're awake, come see the city lights from the top floor. They're better shared." Amelia read the message under the yellow glow of her bedside lamp. For a long moment she simply stared at it, her heart beating fast. Then she rose, slipped on a coat, and stepped into the rain. By the time she reached his building, droplets sparkled in her hair like diamonds. The elevator carried her upward, each floor humming with the pulse of change. When the doors opened, Ethan was waiting by the window. The skyline stretched endlessly behind him. He turned when she entered, his expression unreadable yet gentle. "You came. I wanted to see the lights," she whispered. "They're brighter tonight," he said, stepping closer. "Maybe because you're here." They stood side by side, the city reflected in the glass before them. Neither spoke, but the silence between them was no longer empty. It was full of everything they were too new, too fragile, too human to name. For the first time in a long, long while, Ethan Ward felt at peace. And Amelia Rivers realized that even the coldest hearts could learn the language of warmth. One quiet moment at a time. Asterisk the past that refused to sleep the following. Weeks unfolded like chapters from a book. Neither Ethan nor Amelia could stop reading. Their connection deepened quietly, not through declarations or grand gestures, but through the rhythm of shared moments, the sound of pages turning in the library, the smell of coffee in the morning, the way they both fell silent at sunsets, as if they were listening to something sacred. It was not a love that demanded attention. It was one that grew in silence, steady and deep, like roots beneath the earth. Yet beneath that calm surface, both of them carried ghosts, his hidden behind success. Hers buried beneath gentleness and ghosts, no matter how quiet. Eventually asked to be seen, Ethan had begun to change in ways that didn't go unnoticed by those around him. At Ward International, his board members whispered in marble corridors about their once iron-hearted CEO, who now smiled too easily, missed late-night calls, and lingered in places that held no profit. They feared softness in a man who had built empires on control. One afternoon, his chief financial officer, a sharp-eyed man named Darren Cole, entered Ethan's office with the polished confidence of someone used to delivering bad news wrapped as advice. "You're distracted," Darren said, his tone smooth but edged with warning. "The merger with Adaris Holdings needs your full attention. Investors don't want a dreamer, Ethan. They want a commander." Ethan leaned back in his chair, studying the skyline through the glass wall. Maybe it's time they had both. Darren frowned. "You're risking everything for what? A woman from a failing bookstore? Don't misunderstand me. Compassion looks noble in speeches. But this is business. The world doesn't reward sentiment." Ethan's jaw tightened, but his voice remained calm. "Maybe the world's been wrong all along." When Darren left, slamming the door just enough to make a point, Ethan exhaled slowly. Once, those words would have cut him. Now, they only reminded him that peace always costs something, and for the first time, he was willing to pay. That evening, he found himself walking toward the library without deciding to. The doorbell chimed as he entered, and the familiar smell of paper and lavender met him like a sigh. Amelia stood behind the counter, her hair tied loosely, a pencil tucked behind one ear. She looked up and smiled in surprise. "You're early today. Needed to be somewhere real," he said simply. Setting down 2 steaming cups of coffee, she tilted her head, sensing the weight in his tone. "Rough day?" He hesitated, then nodded. "People think I'm losing my edge because I've started to care." Amelia came around the counter, her steps soft but sure. "Then they don't understand what real strength looks like. It's not in what you build, Ethan. It's in what you heal." Her words slipped into him like sunlight into frost. He reached out, almost without thought, brushing a stray strand of hair from her face. "You always know how to quiet the noise." She smiled faintly. "Maybe because I've lived in silence long enough to recognize peace when I see it." They stood close enough for the air between them to hum with something unspoken. For a moment, the rest of the world, the noise, the expectations, the endless hunger for more, disappeared. There was only the steady rhythm of rain beginning again outside, and the strange, beautiful feeling of being understood. The next morning brought news that shattered the calm. Amelia's mother had taken a sudden turn for the worse. The call came as she was shelving new donations. Her hands trembled as the doctor's words blurred together: critical cardiac complications, hospital. She rushed from the library, barely aware of the tears streaking her face. Ethan found out an hour later when he arrived to surprise her with lunch and found the library dark. He called, but there was no answer. When he finally tracked her down at St. Mary's Hospital, he saw her through the glass window of a dim corridor, sitting beside her mother's bed, holding her hand, whispering softly through tears. For the first time since he'd met her, she looked small, fragile, kind of fragile that makes the heart ache to protect. He entered quietly, not wanting to intrude. When she saw him, she didn't speak, only reached for his hand as though it were the only thing keeping her steady. He stayed there all night, silent, unmoving. A guardian in a tailored suit who had never prayed before, but found himself doing it now in the quiet language of the heart. At dawn, the monitors steadied. Her mother's breathing grew stronger. When Amelia finally looked up, her eyes were red but soft with gratitude. "You didn't have to stay," she whispered. Ethan smiled faintly, exhaustion lining his face. "Yes, I did. You've spent your whole life holding everyone else together. It's about time someone stayed for you." Tears filled her eyes again, not from sadness this time, but from the quiet relief of being seen. She squeezed his hand, and for the first time, he leaned down and pressed a gentle kiss against her forehead, not as a promise, but as a prayer. In the days that followed, Amelia's mother began to recover slowly. Ethan visited every evening, sometimes bringing flowers, sometimes books, but mostly his quiet presence. He became part of the rhythm of their lives, sitting by the window while Amelia read aloud to her mother. He never interrupted, never tried to fill the silence. He simply existed beside them, a man learning how to belong to something softer than ambition. But peace rarely lasts unchallenged. One afternoon, as Amelia closed the library early to visit the hospital, she was intercepted outside by a woman in a designer coat, her perfume expensive and cold. "You're Amelia Rivers?" she asked, her tone clipped. "Yes." "I'm Victoria Hale, Ethan's former fiancée."
Ow.
The words struck like a bell. Amelia froze, unsure what to say. Victoria smiled, the kind of smile that never reached her eyes. "I thought I should warn you, men like Ethan don't change. He might play savior for now, but people like us are projects to him. When he's done fixing what's broken, he'll move on." Amelia's breath caught. "You don't know him anymore." "Darling," Victoria said softly, almost pitying, "I knew him well. Enough to recognize a phase when I see one."
Eyes.
Left a card in Amelia's hand, embossed with the logo of Ward International, before turning and walking away with the quiet confidence of someone who'd just planted a seed of doubt that evening. Amelia tried to focus on her mother's recovery, but Victoria's words echoed like distant thunder. Could someone like Ethan, born into power and distance, truly understand love that wasn't built on need or control? She pushed the thought away, but doubt once awakened. Doesn't sleep easily. Ethan noticed the change almost immediately. She smiled, but her eyes no longer lingered. She laughed, but it came out quieter, like she was afraid of something unseen. Finally, one night, he couldn't stand it any longer. They were in the library again, the city lights glowing through the windows. "You're pulling away," he said softly. "Why?" Amelia hesitated, then met his gaze. "I met Victoria." His expression hardened instantly. "What did she tell you?" "That I'm just another project. That once I'm fixed, you'll lose interest." Ethan's eyes darkened, not with anger at her, but at himself, at the truth that he had once been exactly that kind of man. He exhaled slowly. "She's right about who I was, but not about who I am now. You're not a project, Amelia. You're the only thing in my life that's ever felt real." Amelia's eyes glistened. "Then prove it. Not with gifts or gestures. Prove it by staying when things aren't easy, by being there when it doesn't make sense to." He stepped closer, his voice steady. "Then I'll stay, even when you tell me not to." For the first time, she didn't push him away. Instead, she let herself rest her head against his chest, feeling the steady rhythm of his heartbeat. The walls between them, built by years of fear and distance, finally began to crumble. But the world outside had its own plans. A week later, Ethan's board forced an emergency vote. Darren Cole had gathered enough signatures to challenge his leadership, citing emotional compromise and personal entanglements that threatened company interests. Ethan faced the choice between protecting his position or protecting his peace. That night, he went to the library where Amelia was closing up for the day. She looked up as he entered and saw the exhaustion in his eyes. "It's happening, isn't it?" she asked quietly. He nodded. "They want to remove me. What will you do?" He smiled faintly. "For the first time, I don't know. And it feels ... honest." Amelia walked up to him, her voice trembling but sure. "Then whatever happens, don't let them take the part of you that's finally free." He looked at her for a long moment, then reached out and took her hand. "No matter what they take. They can't touch what you've given me." Outside, thunder rumbled again. Distant but approaching, the kind of storm that changes everything. That night, as rain began to fall once more, Ethan stood before the window of his penthouse, staring at the city reflected in the glass. He had spent his entire life building towers that touched the clouds. But only now did he realize the truest thing he'd ever built was invisible, a bond made not of power but of tenderness, not of ownership but of choice. And somewhere across the city, in a small apartment that smelled of books and chamomile, Amelia whispered a prayer that when morning came, the man who had once conquered the world would choose to conquer himself instead. Asterisk. When the towers fell, the storm that had been brewing for weeks finally broke with a vengeance. The morning of the board vote arrived, wrapped in a thick, colorless fog that clung to the glass of Ward International's headquarters like breath on a mirror. The air itself felt heavy, as though the city knew something was about to shatter. Inside the towering building of glass and steel, Ethan Ward stood before a long mahogany. Tables surrounded by 12 board members, men and women, who had once hailed him as a visionary. Now eyeing him with the cold precision of vultures circling a wounded lion, his reflection glimmered faintly in the glass wall behind him. The city spread out below like a silent witness. He had fought wars of acquisition, weathered economic crises, and turned bankruptcy into empire, but nothing had ever felt quite like this moment, because for the first time in his life, what was at stake wasn't money, it was meaning. Darren Cole stood at the far end of the table, immaculate in his dark suit, papers neatly stacked before him. "We all respect your legacy, Ethan," he began smoothly. "But the last few months have made it clear your personal distractions have compromised your ability to lead. Investors are uneasy, projects are delayed, and this company or company stands on the edge of instability. We need strong leadership, not sentiment." Ethan listened without interruption. He knew Darren's speech by heart. He had written similar ones himself years ago. when he had risen to power by replacing another man who dared to care too much. The irony wasn't lost on him, but he was no longer the same creature of ambition he'd once been. When Darren finished, Ethan stood slowly, buttoning his jacket with deliberate calm. "You're right," he said quietly, his voice carrying through the silent room. "I have changed. And you're terrified because you don't understand it. You think kindness is weakness, empathy is distraction, and peace is failure. You've built your lives around fear, fear of loss, fear of being replaced, fear of feeling anything at all. But here's the truth. A company without a soul is already bankrupt, no matter what its balance sheet says." Murmur rippled through the room. Darren's smirk faltered. Ethan's eyes swept over them, these men and women who had shared his empire, but never his vision. "If you believe I'm no longer fit to lead, then take your vote. But understand this, the only thing I've done wrong is remember what it means to be human." The vote was swift. When it ended, Darren's expression was a mask of triumph. Ethan's title was gone, his authority stripped. He collected the papers before him and walked out without a word. Yet there was no anger in his stride, only an unfamiliar lightness, as if something heavy had finally been set down after years of carrying it. Asterisk. When the elevator doors closed behind him, Ethan felt the first sting of the wind against his chest. His entire empire, built over decades, had crumbled in less than an hour. He should have felt devastated. Instead, there was a strange calm, like the silence after a storm's final roar. The city stretched endlessly below, its rhythm unchanged by his fall. He had always believed his power came from control, from shaping the world to his will. But as he stepped out into the street, umbrella forgotten, rain falling in cool rivulets down his face, he realized something profound. The world didn't need him to control it. It only needed him to live honestly within it. He didn't go home to his penthouse that night. He went to the one place that had never judged him, the small library tucked between the florist and the cafe. The lights were still on. Through the window, he saw Amelia, sitting cross-legged on the floor, surrounded by piles of returned books. She looked peaceful in that small, cluttered space, her hair falling loose, her focus entirely on her work. For a long moment, Ethan just watched her. This woman, with her soft voice and fierce heart, had undone him in all the best ways. He opened the door quietly, and the familiar chime rang out. Amelia looked up, startled. "Ethan." He smiled faintly. "I didn't want to go anywhere else." She stood quickly, concern flashing across her face, as she noticed the dampness of his suit, the exhaustion in his eyes. "What happened?" "I lost everything," he said simply. Her breath caught. "Oh, Ethan." He shook his head before she could say more. "No, don't be sorry. I think I finally understand what my father never did. You can't build anything real on fear and pride. The towers I built, they were beautiful, but they were hollow. Maybe they needed to fall so I could finally see what was worth saving." Amelia walked toward him, her eyes glistening. "And what's that?" "You," he whispered. The room fell into stillness. The rain tapped softly against the window, as if marking the rhythm of their breaths. She wanted to speak, to say something that could hold the weight of that moment, but no words came. Instead, she stepped forward and wrapped her arms around him. For the first time, Ethan let himself truly fall not from power, but into peace. Days passed, and the world moved on. The newspapers called his resignation a quiet scandal. Business analysts debated his downfall with sterile fascination. Some praised his integrity. Others mocked his sentimentality. But Ethan ignored it all. He spent his mornings volunteering at the library, helping Amelia organize, painting walls, repairing shelves. He learned the satisfaction of simple work, the kind that left hands tired but hearts full. It wasn't easy. There were nights he woke in a sweat, haunted by echoes of his old life voices, of investors demanding, deadlines screaming, the relentless pulse of ambition. But Amelia was always there, steady as dawn. When doubt crept in, she would hand him a cup of tea and remind him softly, "You don't need to prove your worth anymore. Ethan, you just need to live it." Her mother grew stronger. and laughter began to fill their small apartment again. Sometimes Ethan joined them for dinner, sitting at the old wooden table that wobbled slightly but held more warmth than any banquet he'd ever attended. The three of them would talk about everything and nothing, the price of books, the best soup recipes, the way rain made the city smell new again. Those evenings became his anchor. But the world doesn't let redemption come without a test. One morning, Amelia arrived at the library to find a letter slid under the door. The envelope bore the emblem of Ward International. Inside was an offer. Ethan's former company wanted to buy out her library property to build a luxury retail complex. The sum they offered was staggering, more than enough to secure her family's future. But the project's signature carried Darren Cole's name. Amelia's heart twisted. She knew what this meant. It was a challenge, a provocation, perhaps even revenge. Darren wanted to force Ethan's hand to watch him lose the one place he cared about. That evening, when Ethan came by, she handed him the letter silently. He read it, his expression unreadable. "You can't refuse it," he said finally. "It's enough to change your life." "It would destroy what we've built," she replied softly. He looked at her, torn between the old instinct to fight and the new desire to protect what mattered. "If I intervene, they'll see it as weakness. If I stay out of it, you lose your home. Either way, they win." Amelia stepped closer, her voice calm but firm. "Then let them win, Ethan. Let them think they've taken everything. You and I both know that the things that truly matter can't be bought or broken." He stared at her for a long moment, then exhaled deeply. "How do you do that?" "Do what?" "Turn every defeat into grace." She smiled faintly. "By remembering that love isn't about having power, it's about choosing peace." He reached for her hand then, not with the commanding confidence of a man who once owned the world, but with the humility of someone who finally understood its worth. "Then I choose peace. I choose you." Weeks later, when the demolition notices arrived, the library's regulars came together like a tide of quiet defiance. People from all walks of life, students, retirees, young parents, even strangers who'd once found warmth in the smell of old pages gathered in protest. The story spread through the city. Local news outlets picked it up. "Former billionaire stands with small-town library" became a headline that captured hearts far beyond the neighborhood. Darren Cole's plan backfired spectacularly. Public outrage forced the company to withdraw. The library was declared a cultural heritage site, protected from redevelopment. When Amelia told Ethan the news, he just smiled quietly. "Looks like kindness can shake foundations after all." She laughed, tears in her eyes. "Maybe you've finally built something real, Ethan." He took her hands in his. "No, Amelia. We built it together." That night, they sat beneath the library's warm light after everyone had gone, surrounded by the scent of paper and the hum of peace. Outside, the city glowed under the after-rain sky. Ethan reached into his pocket and drew out something small, a worn brass key. "What's this?" she asked. "The key to the rooftop of the building I used to own," he said softly. "I want to show you something before I give it up for good." They climbed the narrow stairs to the rooftop, where, years ago, he'd once stood alone, measuring his success by how high he'd built above others. Now, standing beside Amelia, the view looked different, less like a conquest, more like a home. The wind carried the scent of rain and distant flowers. Below them, the city pulsed with life. Every light a reminder of people still dreaming, still trying, still choosing love over fear. Ethan turned to her. "All my life, I built walls to keep the world out. You walked through every one of them without force, without demand, just kindness. You didn't save me, Amelia. You reminded me that I could be saved." Her eyes filled with tears. "And you reminded me that even broken things can still build something beautiful." They stood there under the open sky, hands intertwined, no titles, no power, only truth. The rain began again, light and silver, and for the first time, it didn't feel like an ending. It felt like renewal. Asterisk, the light beyond the storm months passed after the battle for the library was won, and the rhythm of life began to find its gentle balance again. The small street corner that once went unnoticed now drew visitors from across the city. Journalists, students, and dreamers who wanted to see the library that had humbled a corporation and touched hearts around the world. But for Amelia and Ethan, the attention meant little. Their lives had settled into something quieter, something real. The mornings began with the smell of fresh coffee and the soft chime of the library door. And the evenings ended with laughter shared over simple dinners. They had no titles, no pretense, and no need for grand declarations. Their love existed in the smallest things, the way Ethan still arrived early to open the shutters before she came in, how Amelia left handwritten notes in the books he liked to read, or how they would sometimes just sit together in silence, perfectly content in each other's company. Yet beneath that calm surface, both of them knew that peace, like a fragile blossom, must be guarded from the winds that forever test its roots. It was on a chilly autumn morning when the first sign of that wind arrived. Ethan was fixing a loose window latch when his phone buzzed on the counter. The number flashing on the screen was one he hadn't seen in months, Darren Cole. For a moment, he considered ignoring it, but something inside told him this was unfinished business that wouldn't vanish by silence. He answered. Darren's voice came through cool and measured. "I heard you've been playing librarian these days," he said mockingly. "Interesting way to waste your talents." Ethan didn't rise to the bait. "What do you want, Darren?" he asked calmly. "Your signature?" Darren said. "I'm expanding Ward International overseas. We need your release of claim from the old projects you started. Legal formality? Nothing more." But Ethan knew better than to take Darren at his word. "Email it," he said simply, and hung up. Asterisk. Later that evening, he reviewed the document. Buried within the legal jargon was a clause transferring ownership of one of his last personal projects, a children's art and literacy foundation, to corporate control. It wasn't just business. It was erasure. Darren wanted to undo the one good thing Ethan had built before stepping down. For a long time, Ethan stared at the paper, his thoughts dark and still. Signing it would mean letting go of the last visible piece of his legacy. Refusing meant another battle, another storm. When Amelia returned from visiting her mother, she found him sitting at the table, the unsigned papers spread out before him. "You look like you're somewhere else," she said softly, setting her bag down. Ethan rubbed the bridge of his nose and smiled faintly. "Just ghosts of the old world knocking again." She walked over, reading the first few lines. "They can't take what you've built for children, Ethan. That's not just a Project Tit's purpose." He looked at her for a long moment. "If I fight them, it becomes another war. And I promised myself I was done with wars." Amelia rested her hands on his shoulders. "Then don't fight for yourself. Fight for what's right. You taught me that gentleness doesn't mean surrender. Sometimes it means standing quietly, but firmly, in the truth." Her words settled into him the way sunlight seeps into frost, soft but undeniable. Ethan folded the document carefully and said, "Then we'll do this our way." The next morning, he drafted a public letter, not an attack, but a confession. In it, he spoke not of betrayal or greed, but of learning. He admitted the mistakes of his past, the hollow pursuit of power, the neglect of people, the blindness of pride, and then he spoke of the redemption he had found through compassion, through community, through the quiet courage of a woman who reminded him that life's truest wealth could never be measured in numbers. He released the letter to the press under his own name, attaching with it the legal proof of Darren's attempted transfer. The message was simple but powerful. We build higher when we build together. Within days, the story exploded. The same networks that had once ridiculed his fall now hailed his integrity. Former employees came forward in support, sharing stories of his fairness, his second chances, his quiet acts of generosity. Darren's coup collapsed under public scrutiny, and the foundation remained independent, run by volunteers and educators. Ethan's name, once synonymous with empire, became a symbol of renewal. But more importantly, the world began to see that power and kindness could coexist, that leadership could be born from humility rather than control. When Amelia heard the news, she didn't cheer or cry. She simply walked into the library, found Ethan repairing a shelf, and wrapped her arms around him. "You didn't just rebuild your name," she whispered. "You rebuilt hope," he smiled, resting his chin lightly on her hair. You gave me the blueprint. Winter came softly that year. Snow dusted the rooftops like powdered sugar, and the city seemed quieter, as if it too had learned to breathe again. The library's windows glowed with warm light, and on the inside, the tables were crowded with children reading stories aloud, their laughter echoing against the wooden shelves. Amelia had started a community reading program in partnership with Ethan's foundation, offering free books and classes for children who had never known the comfort of stories. Watching them, Ethan often felt a lump rise in his throat, a rare mix of pride and peace. He had built towers that reached the sky, but this, he realized, was the first thing he had ever built that truly touched hearts. One evening, as the snow began to fall again, Amelia and Ethan stood outside after closing. The street was quiet, the world blanketed in white, the soft light from the library painting their faces in gold. She shivered slightly, and Ethan instinctively slipped his coat over her shoulders. "Still taking care of everyone else?" she teased gently. He smiled. Old habits die hard. They walked slowly through the snow-covered street, their footprints forming twin paths behind them. Amelia glanced up. "Do you ever miss it? The power, the noise, the constant motion?" Ethan thought for a moment before replying. "I miss parts of it, yes, but not enough to trade what I have now. For the first time, I don't feel like I'm running towards something or away from something. I'm just here." He stopped, looking up at the falling snow. "You know, when I built skyscrapers, I thought height meant success. But I see now that the real beauty of a building isn't how high it stands, it's whether the people inside feel at home." Amelia's eyes softened. "And do you feel at home now?" He looked at her, the faint glow of the streetlight reflecting in his eyes. "For the first time in my life, yes." He stood there for a long time, listening to the world breathe. Somewhere nearby, a church bell chimed softly, and children's laughter drifted from the corner cafe. The simplicity of it all felt sacred. A few months later, on a bright spring morning, Ethan invited Amelia to the rooftop of the new community center they had been building together, space combining his architectural design and her dream of literacy programs. The building stood not as a monument to wealth, but as a sanctuary for growth, every corner designed with warmth and purpose. When she stepped onto the rooftop terrace, she gasped softly. Rows of flowering vines trailed along the glass rails, and a small garden filled the air with the scent of jasmine and mint. At the center stood a stone plaque engraved with the words, "For those who believe that gentleness can move mountains." Amelia turned to him, her eyes wide. "It's beautiful," Ethan smiled. "It's yours. You inspired every line, every corner. I wanted to give the city a place that breathes the way you do, with grace and light." Tears filled her eyes as she stepped closer. "You've given it far more than that. You've given it heart." He reached into his pocket and produced a small velvet box. Her breath caught. "Ethan." He didn't kneel. Instead, he took her hands, holding them firmly, his voice quiet but full. "I used to believe love was something you earned through success, something fragile that would vanish if you weren't enough. But you showed me that love is patient, that it lives in forgiveness and ordinary moments. I don't need forever promises. I just need the chance to build each day beside you." Amelia's tears fell freely now, glistening in the sunlight. "You don't have to ask," she whispered. "You already have my heart." He opened the box anyway, revealing a simple gold band. No grandeur, it's just a symbol of something unbreakable in its simplicity. When he slipped it onto her finger, the world seemed to still around them. The wind carried the scent of rain. And far below, the city moved on, unaware that high above it, two hearts had found peace after years of wandering. Years later, the library still stood on its little corner, its shelves fuller, its walls warmer. Children came and went, their laughter echoing down the same streets where Ethan had once walked alone in the rain. The plaque on the rooftop garden weathered over time, but its words remained clear. On quiet evenings, Ethan and Amelia would sit by the window with tea, watching the city lights flicker like living stars. And whenever the rain came soft, rhythmic, familiar, they would smile, remembering the night two strangers met in a cafe, both searching for something neither could name. and found instead what they both had always needed, a home within another heart. For in the end, life's truest victories are not the ones written in ledgers or carved in marble. They are the quiet triumphs of kindness, forgiveness, and love that learns to be gentle. Even after the storm, the end.